They were looking for a man. Someone strong, someone fast, someone who could disappear into the shadows of war and never be seen again. What they never expected was a woman, and certainly not a woman with a wooden leg. In Nazi-occupied Europe, where fear ruled the streets and silence meant survival, one name began to spread in whispers, among resistance fighters, among secret networks, and even inside the enemy's own ranks. Virginia Hall. The Gestapo didn't know her face. They didn't know her real name. But they knew one thing. She was dangerous. So dangerous that Adolf Hitler himself ordered her capture. So dangerous that the Nazis called her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. And yet, before the war, America had told her she was unfit to serve, too weak, too broken, too disabled. This is not just a story about war. It is a story about rejection, about resilience, and about a woman who refused to disappear when the world tried to erase her. This is the story of Virginia Hall, the spy they hunted, the woman they underestimated, and the courage they could never break. Her name is Virginia Hall, and before the world knew me as a spy, she was simply a girl who refused to accept the limits placed on her. She was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1906 into a respectable, structured world that expected women to be quiet, polite, and invisible. But from the very beginning, she wanted more. She wanted movement. She wanted purpose. She wanted to step beyond the boundaries drawn for me. As a young woman, she was restless in a way society didn't quite know how to handle. She studied languages, she traveled through Europe, she dreamed of diplomacy, of service, of representing my country on the world stage. The Foreign Service was my goal, a life of meaning, challenge, and responsibility. But destiny had other plans. One accident would change everything. While serving in Turkey, she was handling a hunting rifle when it accidentally discharged. The bullet struck my leg. The injury was severe. Infection followed. Pain became constant. Doctors made the decision that would define my future. My leg had to be amputated below the knee. I was 27 years old. I remember lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something far deeper than physical pain. I felt erased, as if the woman she had been, the ambitious, capable woman, had vanished overnight. When she finally learned to walk again, it was with a wooden prosthetic leg. I named it Cuthbert. A joke, perhaps, but humor was my armor. Because the world no longer saw potential, it saw limitation. I applied again to the U.S. Foreign Service. I believed my mind still mattered, my intelligence, my experience. They rejected me. Not gently, not subtly. They said I was unfit for duty, a liability. A woman with a disability had no place representing America abroad. That rejection cut deeper than any wound. But something inside me hardened in that moment, not into bitterness, but into resolve. If one door closed, I would find another, and if no door existed, I would build one myself. When World War II erupted, Europe fell into darkness. Nations collapsed, cities burned, fear traveled faster than armies. I watched it all unfold with a fire growing in my chest. I knew Europe. I knew languages. I knew how to blend in, how to listen, how to disappear. And I knew this war needed people like me. Britain understood what America did not. British intelligence didn't see my leg first. They saw my mind. They saw my courage. They saw my willingness to go where others wouldn't. And so, quietly, without ceremony, I was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, a secret organization tasked with sabotaging the Nazis from within. I was trained in codes, weapons, surveillance, escape tactics. I learned to live two lives at once: how to smile while lying, how to remember details that could save lives, how to trust no one completely. And then came my assignment: France. Occupied France. A land watched by the Gestapo, where a single mistake meant torture or death. I was sent in under the cover of an American journalist. My mission? Build resistance networks, coordinate safe houses, deliver messages, disrupt the enemy from the inside. I knew the risks. A woman, alone, with a limp. The perfect target. Or so they thought. I moved through cities like Lyon and Vichy with careful precision. I listened more than I spoke. I observed patterns: who talked too much, who avoided eye contact, who was afraid. I memorized streets, exits, hiding places. At night, I transmitted coded messages back to London using a radio hidden inside ordinary objects. Every broadcast was a gamble. If detected, the consequences were unthinkable. But fear never stopped me, because courage, I learned, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. Soon, whispers began circulating. There was a woman organizing resistance, a woman who couldn't be traced, a woman who kept appearing and vanishing. The Gestapo took notice. They didn't know my name, but they knew my impact. And slowly, the hunter became the hunted. They began searching for a mysterious female agent, a woman with a limp. I had become a problem, and for the Nazis, problems were meant to be eliminated. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to become the most wanted woman in occupied Europe. And the most dangerous.
It felt like a trap. Every cafe had ears. Every neighbor carried suspicion. Every knock on the door could be the last sound you ever heard. And somewhere inside this tightening net, she was moving, carefully, deliberately, while the Gestapo searched for me. They didn't know my real name, but they had a description now. A woman, foreign, intelligent, dangerous. And most critically, she walked with a limp. She felt the weight of that knowledge with every step I took through Lyon's narrow streets. My wooden leg, Cuthbert, had once felt like a burden. Now it was a clock ticking too loudly in my head. Each movement had to be calculated, each appearance brief. Still, the work could not stop. The resistance depended on coordination, on trust carefully earned and even more carefully protected. She met with factory workers who sabotaged Nazi equipment from the inside. She worked with railwaymen who delayed troop transports by hours that saved thousands of lives. She helped establish safe houses for downed Allied pilots, guiding them from village to village toward escape routes into Spain. She never stayed in one place for long. A night here, 2 nights there, always moving. At night, she transmitted radio messages to London, encoded bursts of information sent through the darkness. Each transmission increased the risk of detection. Nazi radio trucks roamed the streets, triangulating signals, hunting invisible voices. If they found me mid-broadcast, there would be no escape. So she worked fast, precise, silent. Sometimes she could hear German boots outside while she waited for confirmation from London, my heart pounding so hard she feared it would give me away. But the messages went through, and London listened. Soon, the Gestapo's interest turned to obsession. Posters appeared, raids intensified, interrogations grew brutal. They had a nickname for me, now, the Limping Lady. It was meant to make me small. Instead, it made me legendary. The more they hunted me, the more careful and creative she became. She altered my appearance constantly. Different hairstyles, different clothing, different mannerisms. She learned to walk differently, sometimes exaggerating my limp, sometimes disguising it entirely. She became a dozen women in the span of a week. But pressure was mounting. In late 1942, a warning reached me through a resistance contact. Someone had talked. A name hadn't been given, but a description had. Mine. The Gestapo was closing in. London sent a clear message: get out now. Escape meant crossing the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, on foot, in winter, with a wooden leg. It sounded impossible, but staying was a death sentence. So I prepared quietly. No goodbyes, no explanations. One night, under the cover of darkness, I slipped away from Lyon and began the long journey south. The mountains were merciless. Snow-swallowed paths, cold bit through clothing and bone alike. Each step sent pain shooting through my body. Her guides worried I wouldn't make it. They were wrong. Pain was familiar. Quitting was not. When we finally crossed into Spain, exhausted and half-frozen, I allowed myself one moment of relief. That moment ended quickly. Spanish authorities arrested me. Neutral did not mean kind. I was imprisoned, interrogated, treated as a suspicious foreigner with too many secrets. I told them nothing that mattered. Eventually, after weeks of uncertainty, I was released. I made my way back to Britain. London welcomed me like a ghost returned from the dead. Most agents didn't survive missions like mine. Fewer still asked to go back. I did. The war wasn't finished, and neither was I. But the world had changed. By 1944, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of Europe. France needed coordination, sabotage, leadership from within. I was sent back, but this time under a new organization, the Office of Strategic Services, America's newly formed intelligence agency. The irony was sharp. The country that once rejected me now needed me more than ever. This time, I entered France disguised as an elderly peasant woman. Her hair was gray, her face weathered, her limp now seemed natural, expected. No one looks twice at old women. That invisibility was my greatest weapon. I moved through villages carrying messages hidden in baskets of food. I organized supply drops in remote fields. I trained resistance fighters, men half my age, how to kill silently, how to disappear after a strike, how to survive interrogation if captured. And always, the Gestapo followed the trail. They still believed the limping lady was somewhere out there. They just didn't realize she had returned. As D-Day approached, the work intensified. Bridges had to be destroyed, communication lines severed, German units delayed and confused. Every successful act of sabotage meant Allied soldiers had a better chance of survival on the beaches of Normandy. Failure was not an option. One night, a resistance cell was compromised. Arrests followed. Names were extracted under torture. Mine was among them. Again. I was warned just hours before a raid was scheduled on my location. I escaped through a back window, disappearing into the countryside moments before German trucks arrived. I watched from a distance as soldiers tore through the house I had just left. Close. Too close. By then, I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. But surrender was never a thought that crossed my mind. I had seen too much. The cost of fear, the cost of silence. So I kept going. By the time Allied forces liberated France, resistance networks I had helped build were credited with crippling German operations from within. Thousands of lives were saved. The war moved forward, but my story didn't end with victory parades or public recognition, because the most dangerous missions were still secret. And the greatest irony of my life was yet to come.
Victory, from a distance, looks clean. From the inside, it is anything but. By 1944, France was beginning to breathe again, but the air was thick with paranoia. Liberation didn't erase fear overnight, it sharpened it. Old collaborators tried to disappear, old enemies pretended to be friends, and betrayal became more dangerous than bullets. For those of us still working in the shadows, the rules had changed, but the risks had not. Her role shifted from building networks to protecting them. Resistance fighters she had trained were now targets, not just for retreating German forces, but for rival factions, informants seeking revenge, and those who wanted to rewrite their own wartime pasts. Trust became fragile. One wrong assumption could get someone killed. She spent my days moving between villages, verifying information, securing documents, relocating people who had become liabilities simply by surviving. At night, she lay awake listening for footsteps, wondering whether the war had taught the world anything or merely revealed what it was capable of. And then came the betrayal. It didn't arrive dramatically. There was no shouting, no chase, just a name whispered to the wrong person. A resistance contact she had known for months, someone she had trusted, was arrested during a routine checkpoint. Under pressure, he broke. Not because he was weak, but because the Gestapo knew exactly how to apply pain. Her cover name surfaced, her movement patterns, descriptions accurate enough to be deadly. Within days, German patrols reappeared in areas they should have already abandoned. The war was slipping through their fingers, but they were determined to take as many of us with them as possible, and she was still at the top of their list. I went underground in a way I never had before. No meetings, no radios, no written messages. Only face-to-face communication delivered through trusted couriers who didn't know my identity, only where to deliver information. Loneliness settled in like a second skin. Spying requires isolation, but now it was absolute. I couldn't afford friendships, couldn't afford routine. I slept in barns, cellars, abandoned buildings. I ate whatever I could find. Her leg grew infected from constant movement and lack of care. Pain returned, not as a sharp reminder of injury, but as a dull, relentless companion. And still, she worked. Because the truth about courage is this: it doesn't always feel heroic. Most days it feels like exhaustion. The Germans, desperate and cornered, became more brutal. Entire villages were punished for suspected cooperation. Men disappeared, women were interrogated, children learned to be quiet very quickly. I watched it all with a heavy sense of responsibility. Every operation had consequences, every decision rippled outward. I began to ask myself questions I had never allowed before. How many lives was my work saving, and how many was it endangering? There were no clean answers, only choices. And then, one night, everything collapsed. A rendezvous point was compromised. I arrived late, intentionally, as a precaution. From a distance, I saw the lights. German trucks, soldiers, shadows moving where there should have been none. A trap. Had I arrived on time, I would have walked straight into it. Instead, I watched from the darkness as 3 resistance members were arrested, people I had worked with, laughed with, trained. There was nothing I could do. Intervention would have meant capture. Capture would have meant silence, or worse, information extracted under torture. I turned away. That decision haunted me more than any other. Survival sometimes demands choices that feel unforgivable. By early 1945, German control in France was collapsing. Retreating forces left chaos behind: booby traps, false surrenders, scorched earth. I coordinated final sabotage missions, last strikes meant to delay retreating units and prevent regrouping. One mission went wrong. A supply drop was intercepted. Weapons fell into enemy hands. A resistance cell was exposed. I was blamed. Quietly, indirectly, but the implication was there. Trust, once cracked, never fully repairs. I considered stepping away.
I had given everything, more than anyone could reasonably ask. But the war had taken so much from others that leaving felt like a betrayal of its own. So I stayed until the very end. When Germany finally surrendered, celebrations erupted across Europe. People flooded the streets, flags waved, music played. I watched from a distance. There was no uniform for me to take off, no public identity to return to, just a woman with a limp and a lifetime of secrets. I returned to the United States quietly. No parades, no interviews, no headlines. Officially, my contributions were classified. Unofficially, I was encouraged to forget. I was offered a desk job in the newly formed CIA. I accepted, not because it honored what I had done, but because it allowed me to continue serving in silence. Years passed. The world moved on, but the war never really left me. Faces returned in dreams, names echoed in quiet moments, decisions replayed themselves endlessly. People often imagine spies as thrill seekers, drawn to danger. The truth is far less glamorous. We were people who stepped into darkness because someone had to, and we carried that darkness home with us. Recognition, when it finally came decades later, felt strange, almost intrusive. Medals were offered, praise was spoken, but the cost had already been paid, in full. And I often wondered, if I had been a man, if I had been whole, if I had been believed sooner, how different might the story have been? Those questions had no answers. Only one certainty remained. I had done what I could, when it mattered, against impossible odds. And in the end, that had to be enough.
When wars end, the world expects closure, clear lines, clean victories, heroes neatly defined. But for those of us who lived in the shadows, the end felt less like an arrival and more like a quiet disappearance. She returned to America in silence. There were no welcoming crowds, no ceremonies waiting at the docks, no headlines announcing what had been done in occupied France. My work, like most things worth protecting, was classified. The country was rebuilding its sense of normal. People wanted optimism, simpler stories, men returning home in uniform, women stepping back into familiar roles. There was no place in that narrative for a limping woman who had coordinated sabotage, trained fighters, and survived years as one of the most hunted people in Europe. So she adapted. Again. She joined the Central Intelligence Agency when it was still finding its identity, an organization shaped by urgency rather than tradition. My work shifted from field operations to analysis, training, and institutional memory. It was quieter, safer, and in many ways, harder. She had lived years where every decision mattered immediately, where hesitation meant death. Now, she sat in offices, reviewing reports, training younger officers who would never know what she had done, and they didn't need to. Secrecy had been the price of survival during the war. After the war, it became the cost of service. Occasionally, someone would ask about my limp. She offered simple explanations. An accident, a long time ago. People accepted that easily. What they couldn't imagine was the rest. The nights in barns, the coded messages whispered into radios, the faces of people who never came back. America moved forward at an astonishing pace. Suburbs expanded, families grew, television flickered to life in living rooms across the country. The war became history, something documented, analyzed, simplified. But history has a way of leaving certain names behind. Mine was one of them. In official records, I existed, but barely. In public memory, she did not exist at all. And perhaps that was intentional. The myth of the spy doesn't leave much room for women, especially not women who challenge easy assumptions about strength, beauty, and heroism. She was older now, slower, still walking with Cuthbert, but she was watching the world learn the wrong lessons from the war, watching fear reshape alliances, watching secrecy become permanent rather than temporary. Sometimes young officers asked for advice. They expected technical guidance, tradecraft, procedure. Instead, she told them about judgment, about knowing when not to act, about the weight of consequences, about the people behind every successful operation. Those lessons weren't written in manuals. They were learned in silence. Years passed this way, quietly, deliberately. She never married, never built a family. The work had taken that space in my life, and there was no replacing it. Some people mistook that for loneliness. It wasn't. It was clarity. She had chosen my path, and despite everything, despite the pain, the loss, the invisibility, she did not regret it. In 1966, something unexpected happened. She was summoned. Not for an operation, not for analysis, for recognition. In a small, private ceremony, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors the United States can bestow. The room was quiet, the audience small. No press, no photographs. The medal was placed in my hand, and for a moment, the weight of it surprised me. Not because it was heavy, but because it existed at all. For decades, my work had been denied, minimized, or hidden, and now here was proof. Not for the world, but for history. I accepted it without a speech. What was there to say? That courage doesn't always look the way people expect. That some wars are fought without witnesses. That some victories leave no monuments. The medal went into a drawer. Life continued. In later years, historians began to uncover fragments of my story. Files were declassified. Accounts compared. Slowly, carefully, my name began to surface. Not as a footnote, but as an anomaly. A woman, an amputee, a spy who had outlasted expectations. Recognition arrived late, but it arrived honestly. When people finally asked how she had done it, how she had endured, she told them the truth. She hadn't been fearless. She had been committed. There is a difference. Fear asks you to stop. Commitment asks you to continue anyway. As I aged, my world grew smaller, but my memories remained sharp, and one thought returned again and again. The world remembers wars through generals and dates, but wars are won or lost by ordinary people who decide in extraordinary moments to act. She had been one of them. And when my time came to fade completely from view, I did so the same way I had lived much of my life. Quietly, purposefully, without asking to be seen. The war did not end for me the day Germany surrendered. For the world, there were dates. For me, there was only a gradual quiet, one that arrived too slowly and stayed too long. After the ceremonies ended, after the headlines moved on, after Europe began rebuilding its streets and memories, I returned to a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, nothing was ordinary. Silence had replaced danger, but it was no less heavy. During the war, every moment had demanded awareness, every sound mattered, every shadow carried meaning. Now the quiet stretched endlessly, and with it came something I had long postponed: reflection. I had survived. Many had not. That truth followed me everywhere. I worked for the CIA, yes, but my role was different now. I was no longer the one slipping through borders or carrying messages under false names.
I was the one advising, training, reviewing. I watched young recruits arrive with confidence and ambition. They spoke of service as if it were a ladder, something you climbed. I knew better. Service was a weight you carried, sometimes for the rest of your life. I tried to prepare them, not with stories of heroism, but with warnings. I told them that intelligence work would ask for parts of themselves they might not be ready to give, that it would blur moral lines and offer no clear victories, that secrecy, once accepted, never truly loosens its grip. Some listened, most didn't. Experience teaches lessons that words cannot. As the years passed, the world entered new conflicts, new enemies, new fears. The Cold War reshaped priorities, and the methods we once used became templates for something larger, more permanent. Sometimes I wondered whether we had won peace or simply perfected secrecy. My own story remained buried, not erased, just inaccessible. And that invisibility came with a strange duality. On one hand, it protected me. On the other, it slowly hollowed out something. People around me spoke freely about the war, about generals and battles and strategies. They debated decisions as if lives had been abstract variables. I listened, and I stayed silent. Because how could I explain the reality? That courage often looks like fear controlled just long enough to act. That victories are built on moments no one ever documents. That survival sometimes depends on turning away when every instinct tells you to stay. There were nights when memory returned uninvited. A radio crackling in the dark. Footsteps outside a door. A name spoken too loudly. I would wake and reach for my leg, Cuthbert, as if checking that some part of me still existed in the present. A reminder that I was no longer running. Age arrived quietly. My body slowed, my world narrowed. And yet my mind remained alert, still watching, still measuring. Occasionally, someone would stumble upon a fragment of the truth, a historian, a curious colleague, a journalist following a thread that refused to disappear. They asked careful questions. I answered cautiously, not out of fear, but out of habit. Secrecy, once learned, becomes instinct. But as time passed, something shifted. Files were declassified, accounts cross-referenced, patterns emerged. Slowly, my name stopped being invisible, and when recognition finally arrived, it arrived without drama. No grand revelation, no sudden applause, just acknowledgement. A confirmation that what I had done was real, that it mattered. Some people expected relief. What I felt instead was distance. Not because I resented the delay, but because I had lived too long without expectation. Validation, when it comes late, feels almost unnecessary. And yet, it mattered in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not for me, for others. For women told they didn't belong, for people labeled unfit, broken, insufficient. My story became proof, not that anyone could be a hero, but that the definitions had always been wrong. Heroism was never about perfection. It was about persistence. I began receiving letters from students, from veterans, from people who had never seen themselves reflected in history before. They thanked me for something I had never intended to offer. Permission. Permission to persist. Permission to serve differently. Permission to refuse disappearance. That, I realized, was the part of the mission I had never planned for. The war required secrecy, but the future required truth. And so, when my time approached its natural end, I found peace not in recognition, but in continuity. The work had not ended with me. It had simply changed hands. And somewhere, quietly, I hoped that the next person standing in the shadows would feel a little less alone, because someone, once, had walked there before. With fear, with resolve, with a limp, and had refused to stop.
History often remembers wars through noise, explosions, marching armies, victories declared in public squares. But the truth lives elsewhere. It lives in the quiet decisions made by people who knew they might never be remembered. She was never meant to be a symbol, never meant to inspire. She was meant to be effective. That was the measure of success in the world I lived in. Results without recognition, impact without applause. For years, my story stayed hidden, locked away in files stamped classified, spoken only in fragments, if at all, and that was fine, because the people who mattered most already knew. The pilots who made it home, the resistance fighters who survived another night, the soldiers whose landings were made possible because bridges were gone and communications were silent. Those were the real rewards. She didn't fight because I believed I was exceptional. She fought because I refused to believe that limitation was destiny. They told me I was unfit, that I was broken, that I did not belong. What they didn't understand was this: strength is not the absence of weakness, it is the refusal to surrender to it. My wooden leg never stopped me. Fear never stopped me. Even obscurity never stopped me. Because purpose is louder than doubt, if you listen closely enough. When people finally learned my name, many focused on the wrong thing. They talked about the limp, the disguise, the danger. Few talked about the discipline, the patience, the moral weight of every decision. Spying isn't about daring escapes or clever lies. It's about responsibility, about carrying secrets that could cost lives if mishandled, about choosing silence when the world demands stories. She lived long enough to see a different generation ask different questions. Questions about who gets remembered, about who gets erased, about how many stories like mine were never told at all. And maybe that is the real legacy. Not that she was one woman who survived impossible odds, but that she proved what is possible when the world underestimates you. She didn't change history alone. No one ever does. But she stood in the spaces where history bends, quietly applying pressure until something shifted. And when my time ended, she left no monuments behind, only ripples. Ripples in the lives that continued, ripples in the freedoms preserved, ripples in the idea that courage has no single shape. If you remember anything from this story, let it be this: the most powerful people in history are not always the loudest, not always the strongest, not always the ones the world chooses to celebrate. Sometimes they are the ones who walk with a limp, move through shadows, and refuse, absolutely refuse, to disappear.